So tonight I wanted to explore with you what permaculture can offer in terms of robust solutions to slow down our climate crisis. And I wanted to take you on a journey with slides to some of the best practice projects that I've come across. Some that have been scientifically tested, that are replicable and also scalable. So from everything from our own forest garden that we've been developing since the mid-90s, to a small farm in France, and then across the Atlantic to a project that's both restoring rainforest and creating a multi-strata food forest in Belize, which isn't just about growing food, but is also about creating livelihoods, but growing timber for construction, medicinal plants, and also plants that can be then made into products to create a local income. And I also want to tell you a little bit about Common Earth, which is a project that works with the Commonwealth Secretariat to see regenerative initiatives into cooling the planet among 54 Commonwealth nations. And I'd like to finish off with the work of Brian von Hersen, who is practicing something that he calls ocean permaculture, that's literally regenerating marine ecosystems as well as growing food. So I'm going to take you on this journey, and I'm going to do a screen share so that you can see my slides. I don't know if you can still see me when I have the slides up, but there we are. So I'm very deeply aware that when I was asked to give this talk for XR Godalming, we were living in a completely different world. We were, obviously climate change was becoming much more accepted, to the fore. We'd had the October XR events, and we'd had the shutdown in London, particularly, which I felt was very politically significant, and that means XRs was certainly making a big impact. And now we have COVID-19. It seems like, in a weird way, climate has taken a back seat because of our global pandemic. And in another way, I have never seen so many people getting in touch and wanting to know more about permaculture. A lot of it is motivated through a realization of the fragility of our food supply, our just-in-time supermarket supply chain, and a lot of it is also that many of us have had an opportunity to slow down a little bit in lockdown and hear the birdsong and look at the skies and not see vapor trails of jets flying around the world. And for a brief pause, this is a very different time. So there's a part of me that wants to talk in terms of when we are let out of this situation, and when things they'll never go back to normal, but when they change again, I'm hoping that we can raise an even more urgent agenda to change the world, because evidently we really need to. The way we produce our food, the way we fly it around the world, with the way we fly human beings around the world, the way we destroy ecosystems, everything about how we inhabit this planet as industrialized nations is having severe effects. So put this in context, this talk, with the idea of change, resilience, and happiness as well. So let's move a slide. That would be good. Here we go. So here's the happy walking stick. The walking stick is just obscured by the lovely people in Godalming on my screen, but I hope you can see it. So in 2015, on April the 13th, we hit nearly 405 parts per million of CO2. By last year, it exceeded 415 parts per million. And scientists started to tell us that we had a 93% chance of the planet being 4 degrees centigrade warmer than it is today by the end of our century. June of 2019 was the hottest on record. The hottest single day was so intense that temperatures were as much as 10 degrees centigrade higher than normal across France, Germany, northern Spain, and Italy. And of course, then as we went into our winter and Australia went into its summer, it began to burn. So things are out of control. I wanted to mention a little bit about Paul Hawken, who I met at the Commonwealth in London, because he started to do some work around 2001 about climate change, and he was asking around all the environmental experts in his network whether they knew how to reverse climate change. And he discovered that there was no research at all talking about climate change reversal. There was talking about reducing the rate of climate change, but nothing about actually turning it back. So in 2013, he decided to gather together a team of scientists, and these were professors, research fellows, student postgraduates, scholar volunteers, citizen scientists from all over the world. And he couldn't get funding to develop what he called drawdown. So they worked as volunteers for much of the beginning of this process. And what they did was they assessed hundreds and hundreds of pages of research and mathematical models, and they wanted to rank solutions to climate change reversal in terms of the net costs of those solutions, the operational savings, and the benefits that could occur from society if they were implemented between 2030 and 2050. So they were looking at a really fast, short-term scenario for climate reversal. And they used carbon as the currency. So they calculated the relative impact of things like nitric oxide and methane, and they used carbon dioxide as the currency to other greenhouse gases. And they wanted to calculate the total amount of gigatons saved by implementing these models. Now, I'd like to just talk, because we're thinking about permaculture particularly tonight, I'd like to have a bit of a focus on regenerative agriculture at first. So regenerative agriculture is about no tillage, diverse cover crops, so as little bare soil as possible, creating in-farm fertility, not using any pesticides or synthetic fertilizers, using crop rotation and generating fertility on the farm. And they reckoned that if the world converted to more regenerative forms of agriculture, this would be the 11th most effective drawdown solution in the list of 100. it would have a net cost of $57.2 billion, but it would also create net savings as well. It could provide enormous financial returns by 2050 on this investment, which is relatively low. So, and critical to this is things like retaining soil, locking up greenhouse gases in the soil, and not exposing the soil so that it off gases, but also just saving huge amounts of greenhouse gases by not using synthetic chemicals in the farm. And the UN also did a lot of calculations around 10 years ago on agroecology, and they calculated that we could convert to agroecological systems within 10 years if there was political will, and that if we did, this idea that it wouldn't feed the world is not true. It would feed the world, but it would be a radical shift in our food growing systems. And of course, we're seeing a huge shift already, that the community supported agriculture box systems in the UK are massively sold out. They were within the first 2 weeks of lockdown for deliveries. And people like Riverford have been oversubscribed by the thousands and thousands, and small local box systems are sold out. So when there's a crisis, there is an opportunity for change and for relocalization of food, for more regenerative methods, and for chemical-free methods as well. So a bit controversially, I wanted to say something a little bit about holistic planned grazing. I want to say this in the context that Jordan's very, very clear that a plant-based diet is enormously important, and that the majority of the world needs to reduce, we have to reduce our meat consumption. But the science is also there about grazing animals. That at the moment we overgraze animals, we exhaust land, we deforest land in order to put animals in lots, and then we feed them grain, and it has an effect on the loss of carbon sequestration of trees, but also in pasture as well. And that when we return animals to graze in more natural ways that mimic how animals graze in the wild, in tight clusters, being able to be moved on daily, so that they're not standing in their own manure and they're not eating up worms, intestinal pests in their gut, and when the land is allowed to rest and other creatures like dung beetles come on to the land and take the manure down into the soil, something very significant happens, and the soil begins to grow and accumulate at a far faster rate. And when we have healthy pastures, we have the capacity to sequester CO2 in the actual pasture of the soil. So this solution to introduce holistic planned grazing, it was ranked at 19th in the world, with this net cost of 50 billion to convert. So it's a much less intensive, kinder, healthier, better way for to manage grazing animals. I won't go into, I'm not going to argue the science of it tonight, but I don't think we're ever going to eliminate the role of animals in particularly traditional societies, particularly places like India, where the cow is a member of the household and provides all sorts of yields, not only milk, but also dung, which is used in biomass burners for cooking on and so forth. And the next ranked solution I wanted to mention was women smallholders. When women and particularly local people and particularly indigenous people care for the land, it's been shown scientifically that the land is in much better heart. There are higher levels of biodiversity. So giving over land to women, smallholders, to provide for children in the local community was ranked at 62nd in as one of the drawdown solutions, and has a net carbon saving. So what did his 100 look like? Well, they're really fascinating. You can see the red box here is all the different food connected carbon solutions. Top one was reduce food waste, so getting away from that manicured cosmetic supermarket produce and welcoming back knobbly vegetables, and relocalizing supply to eliminate waste, moving to far more plant-rich diets, so radically reducing the amount of, particularly eliminating industrially farmed meat, looking at silvicultures, pastures, that's trees with grazing, regenerative agriculture I mentioned. There are many. Energy is obviously the lime green quadrant, and that's all about wind turbines, solar farms, rooftop solar, geothermal, kind of the renewable industry that has not had political support in Britain in the last, well, since we've had a Conservative government effectively, and feed-in tariffs were abolished. It kind of rather destroyed rooftop solar. And then land use, that's as much about conservation of resources. The two interesting ones is here, which account for the pink sector, are women and girls. And the Drawdown Project found that by educating girls, it helped them to create careers, marry later, and was a really big carbon saver. And that goes hand in hand with family planning. And when those two are combined, it's actually the top drawdown solution. It's the most effective way of preserving greenhouse gases. Of course, if you say that to certain audiences, it is very controversial, but that was the science. Less significant are things like LED lighting and building automation, but one of the drawdown solutions was telepresencing, so that we don't fly around the world burning CO2 and loading the atmosphere. So here's a few more, but I'm going to move through this fairly quickly and take you to Hampshire. So in the 1990s, this was the back of my pocket handkerchief garden in Hampshire near Petersfield, not too far down the road from Godalming. And although it looks rather rural and idyllic, it was actually a very exhausted arable plot. There was, when we took it over, there was absolutely no soil life. There was no topsoil at all. The crops were growing by virtue of being sprayed with chemical fertilizers and then treated for pesticides. It was just really a very bare chalk landscape. Very few birds flew over, and the insect population was utterly minimal. Within under 10 years, we turned it into this. We started by taking the bare soil and sowing a wildflower meadow of chalk downland species, and then we planted around what was a portion of the field a native hedgerow to create windbreaks, and then we began planting trees, and we planted all sorts of different trees, sort of trees you would expect in an orchard: apples, pears, plums, green gages. We planted cobnuts and a walnut tree at the end, and then we infilled with more interesting things like Szechuan and Nepalese pepper and mulberries and fig trees and clove currants. And we went from planting the top tree layer down to the second layer down, and we planted a huge variety of soft fruits, but we kept the centre of the garden as a spring and summer meadow. So it looks fairly wild. It's actually much tidier than this, but I wanted to show you this because of the time scale. And then in one corner is a raised bed, no dig garden. And the effect was extraordinary. In the first year, we were beset with pests. Slugs climbed up and ate the leaves off the apple trees, and the land was just covered in what people would term weed species. And it took a while for the ecology to return. But over time, the ecology did return. And so this is the meadow a couple of years ago with hawksbit and oxeye daisy. It varies very much at different times of year. We have cranesbill and scabious. And this year, I'm astonished and delighted to say we have an early purple orchid that has seeded into the meadow, really showing that the underlying soil life has completely restored in just, I guess it's even less, about 15 years. So it doesn't take long for nature to come back. And with the wildflowers have come the insects, and with the insects have come things like the common lizard, which is really not common in our part of Hampshire above Portsmouth. And we have slow worms, and with insects come birds. So we have all the songbirds you would expect, but we also have red kites and buzzards and sparrowhawks. And basically the food chain and the ecology has revived. And it is a very, very abundant site. It's never been sprayed, and we don't have codling moth because we have bats. And the bats swoop over in the early evening, and we put in lots of little ponds to attract insects, and the bats come in, and they, along with the amphibians and reptiles, manage our pest predator balance. And this has happened relatively quickly. And when we did this, we were complete amateurs. You know, we'd done a little bit of conservation volunteering, but we really didn't know how to restore an ecosystem. We had no experience, no one had taught us. We are publishers. And, you know, we have an understanding of permaculture design, but we don't have, you know, we didn't have experience of creating an edible landscape until we started practicing. And this shot just shows gages and yucca and fig, just to give you an impression of how abundant it is, even for the UK. And it is, you know, by the end of the summer, it gets pretty wild. It's quite difficult to show the extent of the cropping and the growth, but we have huge amount of fruit and apples, and then we have many perennial herbs. We really don't need to go and buy packets of herb tea. They're all thriving in the understory, and it's an incredibly biodiverse, healthy place. We keep honeybees who we don't treat them with chemicals. We do as much, you know, natural beekeeping as possible, and we get really high crops of honey. So this is just a little example of Nepalese pepper, which is one of our favourite crops. I didn't expect to be able to grow my own pepper in the UK, but like many Himalayan plants, it thrives here and is pretty indestructible. It's incredibly thorny. It has the most beautiful aromatic smell to it. And the point of this is to show that we're so limited in our thinking about what we can grow in the UK and what we can grow all over the world. There are so many different crops and so much biodiversity. This is a small no-dig raised bed vegetable garden that is crammed with all sorts of different foods. You would find here what you would expect in terms of annual veg, and then unusual veg as well. And we grow stuff in our greenhouse, which is only 10 by 6 feet. So a small greenhouse all year long. And it also is our propagation area. And the beds itself are hedged by this sort of mini hedge of comfrey, which is a Bocking 14 comfrey, which is basically one of the main constituents of our fertility. We chop it up, we make a huge amount of compost, and we are not exactly self-sufficient in mulch and compost, but we go a long way towards providing for our needs. So this is an example of what two people can do working full-time, given the opportunity and some land. It's about 0.26. It's a third of an acre in total, including the house. And it's not as intensively managed as it could be. We could grow far more food on it, but we're also looking after it from the point of view of species diversity and earth restoration. So I just wanted to take you now to France and to Le Bec-aux-Halloins in Normandy. So this is a 20-acre hectare holding, so much bigger than our place, but 49 hectares are not intensively cultivated at all. So this place only really intensively cultivates the delineated area in this aerial photograph. And here it's got raised beds under cover, as you can see, companion polycultures, and some of it's very intensively planted. Some of it is a forest garden area with lots and lots of edible trees, and some of the farm is just pasture as well. The whole site is designed as a permaculture design, so this means that it uses principles based on the observation of natural ecosystems to create as many closed loops as possible. So trying to grow and produce for the needs of the farm within the farm, and minimizing imports and maximizing energy efficiency in all different aspects. In France, the French conventional wisdom is that one farmer needs 120 hectares of land to be to make a living, to make an economic living. Le Bec supports at least 3 people who are growing on that farm, and that is with just under 2 acres a hectare being intensively cultivated, and the rest of the farm being left to be minimally cultivated. The French National Institute for Agricultural Research say an increase of 4 tonnes per hectare cultivated per year of global organic stock of soils would actually stabilise concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So if as nations switched to regenerative methods, created these food forests, these forest gardens, increased our hedgerows, allowed them to grow much, much bigger in our farming systems, did all these things, minimise tillage, we would build the soil and we would have a potential very quickly to stabilise climate and slow down this kind of roller coaster that's going on and all the habitat destruction. So the Institute Silva and the University of Liège in Belgium published a paper about carbon sequestration on in the soil, specifically at Lebec. And they found that in the forest garden area, that the target for 4 tonnes per 1,000 per hectare was 7 times more effective. So there was 7 times more organic matter in that soil than there is on, there is for achieving that climate slowdown of 4 tonnes per hectare needed. And you'd think, well, that would be logical because it's not tilled, it's not cultivated, it's a perennial system. So it makes sense that that kind of environment would be a real carbon sponge and would soak up CO2. But what they found, unbelievably, is that they have raised beds, and these are raised beds for growing in, and they bury rotting wood in them, so they're called hugelkultures. It's a technique that comes from Austria originally, in Germany. And the rotting wood acts like a sponge, it retains water, and it creates a healthy environment for growing food. And they found that these hugelkulture raised beds were actually 13 times exceeding the 4 tonnes per hectare of soil sequestration. So really effective sponges. But amazingly, they also found that the bio-intensive beds, this is where a lot of the cropping comes in, where the soil is mulched, but I'll show you some pictures here. Here's a typical kind of mix of forest garden and less intensively cropped, and then here's a more mulched intensive home system, and then this is the bio-intensive system that's highly mulched and intensively cropped. And they found that these bio-intensive beds, where as soon as a crop is finished, it's remulched and replanted, very much like Charles Dalding's no-dig garden. They found that these were 26 times more effective as carbon sinks than the ideal of 4 tonnes per hectare. And I can post the link to this study if you read French. It's all there in black and white. So what does this mean? This means that small-scale farms are not, as conventional wisdom would tell us, inefficient. They are highly efficient. They use minimal machinery for cultivation. They require a fraction of the land of larger scale monocultural systems, and they are income generators. By returning to more traditional systems, we can actually employ more people rather than less. So there's another shot of bio-intensive beds under cover, and you can see they plant incredibly close together, and that means it minimises weeds. So that kind of gives us hope for temperate climates. So what can happen in other parts of the world? I mentioned at the beginning Commonwealth, which is an NGO that I'm involved with, which is working with the Commonwealth to establish permaculture and regenerative design and projects in different countries in the world. And I just want to take you very quickly to Belize. So this is apparently a rainforest, but actually about 20 years ago, this farm, indeed, let's be accurate, in 1988, this was a completely exhausted citrus and cattle farm where the land had been eroded and the soil had washed down the valley into the river, and it just wasn't economically viable. And so Christopher Nesbitt, who is a Belizean national now, but comes from the States, bought this piece of exhausted land and started to restore it. And his neighbor, Alfonso Gonzalez, is what he calls one of the absolute gold standard. He passed away last year, but he was his teacher, and he taught him how to grow medicinals, food, fibres and timbers in a Mayan forest garden, food forest way. And so Christopher started creating these very complex stacked polycultures of over 500 species. And he was growing cacao and coffee, but all the different fruits that you can imagine and nuts that you can imagine, tropical. So you can see a banana palm in here. And he started an NGO which is called Mayan Mountain Research Farm. And here's just an example of some of the stuff he grows, and also the beauty of the place. So that I just showed you a pineapple, but this is just a beautiful flowering ginger and crab claw. These are soap nuts that you can extract soap from to wash. This is a medicinal herb from the rainforest that is a traditional Mayan digestive remedy. And this is from memory papaya, and I think guava, and this is coffee, plantains, just a beautiful variety of species. There's also timber species and hummingbird habitat. And what's actually happened in his food forest, that it's become so varied and such an integrated food system, that although he's got some exotics in there, so he's growing turmeric and ginger and other spices as cash crops, he's actually finding that the biodiversity in this, what was a completely derelict farm, is as high or even higher than the surrounding rainforest in the mountains. And occasionally a jaguar whips down from higher up and pinches one of his chickens. It's a very, very beautiful place. He uses stacking to prevent the heat of the sun burning up the soil, because in tropical regions the soil is often thin and easily oxidized. So using tall plants for shade and many different levels of understory. We can't do this in the UK. We just don't have the light levels. So our forest gardens have to be planted much more widely apart. But it means literally the wildlife has come back in. This is a Jesus Christ lizard, because it can dash across water without sinking. And the whole place is alive and sings with frogs, and I've mentioned the hummingbirds and other beautiful birds of paradise. And Christopher's also developed very simple accommodation that is hurricane proof, which is incredibly important, as we know hurricanes are on the increase and utterly devastating to infrastructure. The whole farm is run on renewable energy. It's so off-grid, you actually have to get a dugout canoe or walk through the jungle to get here. This is his wife, Selene Logan, and she works very specifically with empowering young men and women and offering economic opportunities for developing products that can be sold in local markets, like jams and spices and chili sauces and traditional Mayan crafts, and creating more of a culture of self-esteem and resilience, so that the young women have some kind of economic alternative to marrying very, very young. And she's very much about empowering young women and helping them to establish themselves. And the next picture is Alfonso, who was described as the gold standard forest farming teacher, and very much acknowledged as a really valuable elder in the community. I was lucky enough to meet him in 2016. And this is Christopher. And I'm delighted to say that my involvement with Common Earth has offered this man a connection with the Commonwealth that has awarded him a prize as an innovator for developing local economy in his area, as well as the food forest agricultural regenerative system, and also developing so economic benefits, social benefits, and he runs a food system whereby all the food that is in excess on his farm goes to people who are vulnerable in his local Mayan community. So just moving ahead quickly, this is an example of using biochar in a swale, and then I mentioned hugel culture. So this is a hugel swale, so using rotting timber with biochar to sequester carbon and create a really fertile ditch that stops the water running off the land and taking the topsoil with it. And below that they plant things like lines of pineapple to catch all the nutrients and create a crop. This is biochar, and it is literally like a coral reef. It's like a terrestrial coral reef. It has an enormous surface area. We can make biochar out of all sorts of different industrial waste, like the sort of stuff mash that comes out of beer companies, and agricultural wood stem waste and straw waste. We can make it out of you know, coconut shells, and of course coppice wood. What we don't want to make it out of is old growth forest and other non-regenerative ways of burning wood. And this is just a picture of its surface area, where it sucks in nutrients and then holds them and then releases them and builds this incredible colony of living organisms who create beneficial relationships in the soil. And we've heard about a lot lately about the wood wide web. Well, the wood wide web can exist in our gardens and in our farm and in soils in the land, and biochar is one of the solutions for bringing it in and increasing carbon sequestration. And we can not only sequester carbon in agricultural systems, we can use it for filtration to purify water. We can put it into livestock feed to help lock up the carbon in the manure system. We can put it into building systems, so integrate biochar into natural building materials as a way of sequestering carbon. We can make packaging materials that are biodegradable, but ultimately also have biochar in them, so they're sequestering carbon. We can 3D print with carbon. We can use it as a fuel. We can do so much with it. And the idea of May Mountain Research Farm now with the Commonwealth is to explore scaling up the food forest system, not only for food, but for creating this diversification of economic yields that helps local traditional communities become far more independent, economically viable and healthy, and contributes to many of the tick boxes of Hawkins' drawdown. So I'm just, my slides. My slide has paused for me, typically. I hope you can still hear me.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
I don't know why, I think it just has. I don't know what I can do about that, but I wanted to end with a story, and maybe I'll leave my screen and come back and be here, and then we can move on to questions. I just wanted to talk a little bit about Brian von Hersen. I mentioned the idea of marine permaculture, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about his work. So he has spent his entire life as a scientist devoted to exploring how to reverse global warming and also restoring ecosystems, but specifically marine ecosystems using kelp and other seaweeds, and looking at how those systems can also produce farmed products and sequester carbon. So we all know that our oceans are in an utterly dire situation, and that we have many areas of ocean deserts that are expanding year on year, and that ocean acidification is endemic, and over 90% of the heat from global warming is caused by acidification, that the oceans are utterly saturated with greenhouse gases, CO2, and they can't take any more. So von Hersen wants to, a bit like permaculturists want to come along and create food forests that reboot ecosystems and reboot biodiversity. He wants to do the same in marine ecosystems by creating thousands and thousands of new kelp forests, and he calls this marine permaculture. So the key technology here is actually very simple, and they're called marine permaculture arrays. They are large, lightweight latticed structures, roughly half a square mile in size, and they're submerged about 80 feet below sea level. This is to avoid shipping lanes and also extreme weather events as well. And to these arrays, kelp can attach. So we can attach kelp. And these arrays, which could be made from recycled plastics, have buoys attached to them, and these rise and fall with the waves, and they power pumps that bring up much colder, nutrient-rich waters from far below on the ocean floor. And kelp soaks up all these nutrients and begins to grow, and it creates what is called a trophic cascade. So some years ago, George Monbiot did a film about how wild animals reintroduced into Yellowstone, specifically the wolves, moved the grazing animals on and didn't let them overgraze the foliage and the trees, and this created a sudden growth in biomass and recreated habitat for all sorts of species. And suddenly there was this trophic cascade where the benefits of one action created enormous biodiversity and nutrification and restoration of an ecosystem. And this also happens with kelp. So the kelp begins to grow, and the kelp can be harvested as a food source, as a fibre, as animal feed. It can be used as an organic fertiliser. It can even be made into a biofuel. And what happens is that the kelp plants eventually die off, and they drop down to the ocean floor. But while they're alive, they've already started, like all trees and plants, sequestering carbon, and then they drop down to the ocean floor, and they stay there, and that carbon sequestration is not lost. But meanwhile, something else remarkable happens, and this is what Brian said, and I quote him here: "In just 57 hours after deployment, the system sparked plankton growth. Shortly thereafter, these blooms attracted various species of fish. 2 weeks later, a 17-foot, that's 5-metre, shark was seen circling the area, feeding on plankton that had started to bloom." So, and of course, with larger sea creatures comes their nutrients, their poo, which then again feeds the plankton, and the plankton then feed the smaller fish, and then the larger fish come into the system, and sea mammals, and you get this cascade. So from a tiny little species like plankton, you cascade down through all the ecosystem niches, and then you get these large fish and mammals coming into these vast forests to feed. And it deeply inspired me that it only took 57 hours for us to get from growing kelp to and pumping up the colder water to change this kind of like a crust of overheated water where life can't exist and the ocean is desertifying. It only took 57 hours to kickstart the system. So in these pandemic times, I think because of my experience with my own relatively small garden, and how quickly within years the species diversity started to bloom, and just watching how easy it is when you really apply yourself to regrow soil from nothing, from organic matter, from composting systems, and to plant trees and bring back biodiversity, and then to visit the leas and learn that it's possible in a tropical forest as well. And that we can also tag on food for humans and economic yields and social yields as well, to create happier, healthier, more resilient communities. And this for me is gold standard permaculture. This is really what it's all about. It needs political will. It needs to be shared widely, and this is what Commonwealth want to do, is to expand projects and train whole watersheds and bioregions in these techniques. But it is possible, and it is still possible to do it. The door is almost shut, with runaway climate change. But nature also has a powerful role, and if we can create conditions for life, then life will thrive. When we create conditions that are not appropriate for life, it creates natural disasters and human disasters, human scale disasters. We know that species, viruses jumping across species is very much to do with the disastrous ways that we live on this planet, with how we eat and how we circulate as human beings. But we can change things, and I feel that's the most important message. Somehow we have to harness collective will and political will, and have a huge wake-up call after we come out of this pause called lockdown. So I'm going to stop there. I do have some resources I'd like to show the slide, but I'd also like to open up and ask some questions, hopefully answer some questions if I can. I can see there's a question about what's the smallest size of forest garden. I can answer that first, Tim, but I'd like you as the host to tell me how you'd like to proceed.
No, that's good. That's good. You've seen that one, so we might as well start there. We've got a couple more, but yeah, that one from Shirley. What's the smallest size for a forest garden, and then asking if it's counterproductive to remove mature trees and shrubs to convert to a forest garden.
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, there are tiny forest gardens. The idea of forest gardening, in a way, the word forest is a bit too big in our language, but forest gardening was really brought to the UK from Kerala by someone in the 80s called Robert Hart, and he called it forest gardening, and we kind of stuck with it. But the idea of forest gardening is these niches, so that we have ground cover, we have a herb layer, we have climbers, less so in our lower light levels in Northern Europe. We have shrub layer, which is often soft fruits, and then we have small trees and larger trees. And as I said earlier, we need to stretch that out, but we don't have to have all of those constituents. So we can grow a small stacked forest garden in literally a bed. So we can have something like a climbing vine, like I've got a Japanese wineberry, and underneath that I grow all sorts of herbs, perennial, self-seeding, cut and come salad plants like pink purslane and corn salad, and that in a way mimics that stack system that is a forest garden. So literally from an apple tree in a tub that's underplanted with cut and come again salads is mimicking that idea of not having a monoculture, but mixing up your polycultures and mixing up the vertical with the horizontal layer. So from tiny and urban to a whole beautiful large-scale food forest and everything in between.
Excellent, thanks. And actually another quite closely related question from Carol, which was specifically in the example, in your home example that you showed, how big was the field that you converted? Was that included in the third of an acre, or was it just a raised bed?
It's included in it. It was actually 0.26 of an acre to be precise. And the whole plot's a third. And I didn't answer the second part. I'd be fairly, we did actually remove a crack willow from our plot that was very close to the house that was interfering with the drains. So we have cut down mature trees, but not many. So I would try and work with a mature tree, particularly if it's a you know, if it has its value, if it has a wildlife value or a cropping value itself. So not every plot is appropriate for a forest garden for various different reasons. There's a question here about allotments. Shall I go to that one next?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Well, some allotments have restrictions on tree planting, but most allotmenteers can get away with planting perennial veg and shrubs, soft fruit, and some climbers. So I think when you're an allotment holder, mixing it up and not just growing annual veg is really, really useful. A lot of the perennial veg is available during the hungry gap, when most of our annual veg has been eaten up in the winter and the new plantings of spring veg haven't come through yet. So it's really useful on allotment or in a home garden to grow things like perennial kale, and we grow tree cabbage. Tree cabbage is another fantastic plant in a sort of perennial system. It's huge and rather wonderful. Some people call it walking stick cabbage. So I think with allotments, it's very much to do with what your local restrictions are and how you can work your way around them subtly without getting into trouble.
Great, thanks. We've got a couple of questions which are asking what, in your view, is stopping farmers from adopting the sort of mechanisms that you've been describing now? Perhaps what interventions necessary to help it along?
So first of all, I think farmers get a lot of bad press. They were given the Common Agricultural Policy since the Second World War. They were told to farm in a certain way, grow certain crops. They were told to rip out all their hedgerows because that would be more efficient. They were told that large-scale monocultures in many parts of the country were the most economic way of farming, and they were incentivized to farm like that from EU subsidies. So, you know, they've only been working within a system which is a political system. And I don't want to mention the B word and frame it as a good thing because it's a complex matter, but any change in farming policy is an opportunity. And I hope that eventually we'll get some clarity about how farmers are going to be incentivized both to farm for reduced CO2, to mitigate climate change, and also to farm for what Michael Gove was very clear about, which is sort of like the common good, health and well-being of the population at large and biodiversity. So what can they do? Well, already the research is showing that these flailed to bits hedgerows that are hardly surviving in our countryside actually do not reduce yields, that when we have very healthy big hedgerows that are only cut on a much longer cycle, we not only sequester more carbon, but we support nesting bird populations and habitat for insects. And our pastures, which are pastures next to woody hedges, are actually healthier. And animals, of course, have been shown to be higher yielding when they have shade, natural shade in a system. And that's all animals from chickens up to large dairy cows. They actually produce more. So farmers, I believe, will be incentivized not to flail hedges annually, but to let them grow much, much bigger so that they can be shade and habitat and places where carbon is sequestered. That'd be the first one. Things like minimum till and low till. If any of you listen to the Archers, you'll know that minimum till is something that Adam's really up for, and it's been shown, I'm giving myself away there, but it's been shown to be highly productive, growing cover crops. All of these things need to be, it's a matter of education and incentivising. We need to incentivise using less chemicals, not more, by using these methods. And of course, the best way to incentivise people is to prove the economic case and support it economically as well. So, you know, I have mentioned political will. We have to really lobby strongly for saner agricultural policy in the UK and beyond. And we have to quote the science. And the science is there, and it's really becoming very clear that this could make a vast difference to the climate crisis and to biodiversity and our health too.
In a closely related question to what you're just saying, is there have you or the sort of permaculture fraternity been consulted at all by any policy makers?
That's a great question. So the Royal Society of Arts actually did a whole agricultural review that was then fed into government, and one of the people on the panel is a permaculturist and farmer in Wales. So there is, and also there's a agroecological subcommittee, and various different people have given evidence at Westminster and presented information on agroecological and permaculture systems. And then the Oxford Real Farming Conference, which is an annual event in January, is an absolutely inspiring and innovative platform for all sorts of new ideas around food policy, farming, and you know, information for practitioners as well, and academics, and everyone meets up. It's actually a bigger event now than the National Farmers Union Conference. It's bigger, and more people come to it, and they actually turn people away because it's such a vibrant community, and Extinction Rebellion farmers are represented there as well, and so it's a really buzzing place. I go every year. It's brilliant.
Excellent.
And it's going to be regionalised as well. So there is the beginning of, you know, and there's some incredibly wonderful, the Land Workers Alliance is an organisation that is very grassroots, very practical, but absolutely dedicated to lobbying government for these kind of changes that I've been speaking about.
Great, thanks. So we've got a couple of questions from Helen and Emma, which sort of pertain to, I guess, a concern as to whether the kind of practices that we're advocating here, whether they can feed people on the scale that current modern agriculture does. So can we hope to ask farmers to change to more sustainable methods and still feed cities in the way that they and the growing population as they currently do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I mentioned the UN did a report some years ago on agroecology and can it feed the world, and their view was yes, it can. Another oft quoted case study is Cuba, when their oil supply collapsed and they had to convert very quickly to organic farming methods. They had to start using not only, you know, outlying large farms, but suburban food growing areas and indeed urban areas. And they did manage to provide for a population that was starved of imports, and pretty quickly as well, and indeed became experts in Central and South America in farming techniques, and started 4 university departments in the country that then shared that expertise in other countries in their area and in South America. Inevitably, it means change, and it also means land reform. So at the moment, it's very economic for corporations to buy up land and then farm it for subsidies, and that is what's been happening latter part of the 20th century and the 21st century. We need to stop subsidising that kind of chemicalised monocropping system. It also requires looking at our imports and what we eat. I noticed that my friend Liz Zorab is here tonight, and in the next issue of Permaculture Magazine, we're delighted to have an article by, it's our lead article, and it's all about how she grows 85% of her food on a relatively, it's 8/10 of an acre, so a very small holding. But this means changing some of what we eat, and I'm not advocating that we never eat an avocado again, or a pineapple, or you know, something that we can't grow. But what I'm saying is that we've lost touch with our seasonality, we've lost touch with the wonderful array of vegetables that the Elizabethans used to eat in their salad, as they call it. There are hundreds more plants that we could be growing and eating in this climate, and we're educated to eat tomatoes, cucumbers and lettuce in our salad, and frozen peas, and it's incredibly boring diet with our, you know, meat and 2 veg. It's so boring, and we need to get away from that kind of industrialized view of food. So yes, this is lifelong learning. This is about starting with kids, and showing kids how talking about climate change isn't just about shouting slogans in the street, but it's about how we eat, and having a much more engaged and interesting educational system that is proactive and is about us becoming involved and understanding that we can make changes. And yeah, having urban food systems as well as rural food systems and suburban ones, having a food revolution really, and using our land wisely.
And how would this translate to things like that we currently think that we rely on mass production for? If you take, say, wheat, which is such a vital part of our current diet. I mean, perhaps it's not vital, but we currently depend on it a lot. Can you envisage us being able to produce as kind of volumes of it now as we do now with permaculture techniques, or would we simply have to have less of it?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think, yes, we're always going to trade. We're never going to say, right, okay, we're going to become self-sufficient in food. We know that, you know, in a traditional farm, there was always a bit of arable pasture, and then, you know, home garden vegetables. So there's always mixed crops, and we've lost that more traditional balance of having polycrops from a piece of land. We're going to have to eat different things as well. And we don't have to import quinoa from Bolivia. We can grow it in the south of England. We can grow all sorts of bean crops and store them and eat them in the winter instead of relying on imported grains the whole time for protein. That there are so many things that we can do. When you think how, 30 years ago, who ate hummus? Possibly people that had been to Greece, but it wasn't something that we commonly found on the supermarket shelf. Now hummus is sort of a generic shopping product, and that's just a change in fashion over a few decades. And we don't have to make hummus from chickpeas. We can make it from broad beans and fava beans and borlotti beans, and we can grow all these things. So this is really about diversification. And we think we can't change because we want it all to be normal. But the research is that only 9% post-pandemic want to go back to normal. Most people do not want the life that we've left when we escape our lockdown. Sure. Most people want change. And I've only talked about food and farming really tonight, and forest gardening and carbon sequestration. I could talk about economy and home working and how we need to utterly rejig our economy so that it isn't as vulnerable and just in time and completely reliant on imported goods to fulfill our manufacturing needs. We've got to re-examine everything we do in the world in order to change the world and make it a place that we can survive in. Because at the moment, we are not creating a biological system that ultimately can sustain human beings. And you know that better than anyone. You're the Extinction Rebellion, and we're looking at our extinction, aren't we?
Indeed, yes. Thanks. I was when I did the permaculture design course, I was really surprised by how far-reaching its ideas are, far beyond just your growing your food out to sustainable economies and care for each other. It's a really huge and excellent topic. We've got time for two more questions, and then I thought maybe you could just have a couple minutes to mention about Permaculture Magazine, and then we'll close down.
Yeah. I have some links on a slide, but my I think my little computer's overwhelmed by zooming and sharing screens, and the little wheel is circling round.
We will send out a follow-up to the attendees, and we'll make sure we include those. So one probably quick question from Kat is whether Common Earth looks into equal land access in the UK, or if it's only abroad.
At the moment, Common Earth is focusing on identifying best practice projects in Commonwealth nations in other parts of the world. But ultimately, it does want to look at it. We want to find examples of regenerative projects in the UK. There is a very specific criteria for Common Earth, which is, as I mentioned, about ecological, social and economic regeneration. And I'm sure that we will be able to develop and help fund projects in the UK, but we're starting with some nodes in different places in the world. One is working with Indigenous people in New Zealand. Another one is in the Pacific Islands, another one's in Dominica, and the one in Belize. And those are the projects, but they're going to be scaled up, and there'll be another 25 projects identified, and we'll gradually scale things up as we raise the funds to support the trainings and get the information out into the bioregions around this project, and then share the expertise between practitioners. But the most important aspect of this is that we're doing this to support grassroots projects. It really isn't, it's the opposite to the model of a big secretariat coming in and telling grassroots organisations and projects how to run the show. It's more about facilitation to share contacts and resources and skills to enhance those projects and celebrate them rather than tell them what to do. Quite the opposite. So all of the projects are Indigenously led.
Okay, great. And the final one is a somewhat technical question about biochar.
Yeah.
So
there's also a question about mushrooms and marijuana.
there is. We got a few extras in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, the ditches filled with old logs and then covered earlier were described as biochar. Does that mean the wood was burnt before it was covered over?
Okay, so what I showed you, and I did flip through it quite quickly, that was a hugel swale. So it's a ditch dug on the contour, and the idea is to capture the nutrients particularly in the rainy season, so that they don't wash down into the river. And the wood in that instance is put in, not burnt. So the big bits of wood are put in to rot down slowly because they retain moisture and they build soil. But at the bottom of the trench, they put the biochar. And the idea of that is to create this, I said it's like a terrestrial coral reef, to create this opportunity for the biochar to be colonized by all the beneficial microorganisms that constitutes living soil, and they come in and they colonize it and they create these food chains that also pull in the nutrients and lock up carbon dioxide and also hold the fertility in the soil and don't let it leach out with the rain. So it's a mixture of rotting wood and biochar, and the biochar's made from, it's actually made on site. What they do is they burn wood from prunings and trees that have come to the end of their lives, and so they're burning waste material on that site effectively, and then they put the biochar into a pig pen and they nutrify it. So the pigs stamp on it and they poo on it and pee on it, and all that lovely gorgeous manure and nitrogen goes in and is captured by the huge surface area of biochar, and then when it goes into the soil it slow releases it over a very, very long period of time. But it also synergizes the fertility as well. So it doesn't just capture it once with pig manure and then let it go. It's creating this habitat, this extraordinary surface area for locking up minerals and nutrifying the soil over years. And I mean, the traditional wisdom is that this is how terra preta, black earth, was made in the Amazon in South America, and how many of the large Incan civilizations thrived and were able to be such large populations in those areas in South America traditionally, before the white colonists came over and gave them smallpox and influenza and other diseases and wiped them out and pinched their gold.
Thanks, Maddy. Okay, so thank you so much for the talk and the Q&A. That's been really interesting. There are a few other questions left over, and I will, if possible, try and get a couple of answers I'll send out to those people afterwards. But before we close, yeah, if you did just want to mention to the people still here a little bit about Permaculture Magazine.
Thank you very much. So Permaculture Magazine, we founded it in 1992. It is very much about all aspects. Tim mentioned that when he did his permaculture design course, he realised that permaculture was about earth care systems and renewable technology and gardening and farming, but it's also about architecture and climate friendly building. It's also about people and people systems and building community and all the lessons that we can learn. So it's very much evolved since 1992, and it has lots and lots of practical information in it. It also looks at really inspiring cutting edge projects, and we run an annual Permaculture Magazine prize every year. This year it'll be £25,000, which we award to projects that are innovative, regenerative, and use permaculture design, the ethics and the principles modelled on nature to create regenerative, ecological, social and economic model systems, projects in their locality at the grassroots level. And they're usually projects that aren't funded by anyone else, and then we report on it. So it's a mix of sort of articles looking at critiquing our economic system, offering alternatives. For example, Spain's going to adopt the universal basic income, is working on fast tracking that due to Corona. We reported about UBI years ago as an idea. So we're very much a hub of climate friendly, innovative, community based solutions, from what perennial veg to grow and how one person might be virtually self-sufficient, to urban projects and beyond, and health and well-being. So that's Permaculture Magazine. We also run a book publishing company that we've been running since 1990, and we've published over 100 and something books about all aspects of ecological solutions, from energy to building to woodland management and farming, and lots about gardening as well, and forest gardening. And then we have a YouTube channel, which is Permaculture Magazine on YouTube, if you just put that in your search box. And we've got over 100 films there, and we feature everything. It's deliberately eclectic. So everything from a recent one we made was how to build a brassica cage, to interviews. Got one with Liz Zurab, who's who's the lead article in the next magazine about how she grows her food, and we visit her plot. We've got stuff about rewilding and reintroduction of beavers into Cornwall. It's really very, very varied. We've even got some wonderful poetry by Drew Dellinger to uplift and inspire. So it's a very lively and varied YouTube channel. And then we have our website, permaculture.co.uk, and that's been running since about 1995, since the beginning of the internet really, and websites. And that is just stacked with articles, information. So there are paid for gateways with the mag, and then there's lots of free stuff too. But anyone who subscribes to Permaculture Magazine gets to read our entire inventory of back issues, which on Friday will become 103 back issues, totally free of charge. for £14.95 a year. So Permaculture Magazine, you can read it every day, and it's cheaper than a cup of tea.
Thank you very much. Maddy, that's been really good. Thank you again for your time and for joining us today. Hopefully it won't be for the last time. And yeah, for anyone else, I think most of the attendees that are still here are from XR, but for anyone that's not, if you're interested in finding out more about XR Godalming or regionally and what we're up to and how you can get involved, then please email us at xrgodalming@gmail.com. We will be sending out a follow-up email to all of you with some links to the materials and sites that Maddy's been talking about, as well as some more information about how to get involved and how to get in touch with us. So a short overrun, but I hope it's been valuable time for you all, and can see quite a lot of thanks coming up in the chat to you. So yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks very much, XR Godalming, for asking me, and thanks everyone for turning up and spending your time here on this platform. It's much appreciated, and on a busy Earth Day.
Oh yes, happy Earth Day, everyone.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks for all your work in Godalming as well.
Thank you. Bye all.